All right, well, welcome everybody. I think we can get started. What do you think, Jonah?
Yeah, people will likely come in within the next few minutes, but we'll admit them so you can start.
Awesome. All right, well, greetings everyone. My name is Allison Linder. I'm a senior regional planner here at SCAG and also the Clean Cities Coalition Director and primarily managing SCAG's work in clean transportation technology. So I'm really excited to welcome you here today to talk about the results of our passenger electric vehicle study and some of the tools that we've created for cities and other entities across the region. Today's presentation is part of our Toolbox Tuesday series. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. So just a tiny overview. Today's meeting will be about an hour and a half. We're scheduled to end at 2:30, although we have a little flexibility if people have questions and that bleeds over a little bit beyond 2:30, no problem. Participant lines are muted, but you can use the raise hand function or the chat if you want to have a questions. We've kind of broke up the presentation where we have a few pauses where we have an opportunity for questions and comments. Part of the great thing about the Toolbox Tuesday series is that you can learn from SCAG as well as learn from each other. So if people have comments about their experience or best practices they want to share, we will give you an opportunity for that as well. And a recording and slides from today will be available on the SCAG website. Next slide, please. So just a quick agenda for today. I'm going to kick us off and just give a quick overview of the SCAG Clean Technology Program so you have a sense of some of the other resources and services this program provides and where the passenger electric vehicle study, which is the focus of today, fits into the broader program. And then we'll really dive into some of the tools of that study. In particular, some of what we've learned about permitting strategies in compliance with AB 1236 and AB 970. We'll talk about our site suitability scoring process and the results of that analysis and how it can be used by cities and where it can be found. The big question on everybody's mind, how can we fund our electric vehicle transition? And we'll also talk about some of the communications materials we've developed and some of the findings from our outreach. Next slide, please. So just as a way of a quick overview, SCAG has a clean technology program. As I mentioned, I'm primarily overseeing that. Next slide, please. And the program has been part of SCAG's core work for years due to the air quality challenges the region faces, as well as the GHG goals set by the state. But in our 2020 Connect SoCal plan, the Regional Council adopted what we called the Accelerated Electrification Key Connection. And this is actually going to be renamed in our upcoming 2024 plan, but the intent and the goals and objectives will be similar. We want to create a holistic and coordinated approach to decarbonizing or electrifying passenger transit and goods movement vehicles. And we set an overall vision for a zero emission transportation system and the use of near zero emission or cleaner mobility options where zero emission isn't fully feasible. So the long-term vision is to get to a zero emission transportation system with use of supporting technologies along the way. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the SCAG Clean Technology Program primarily does work in, I would say, 3 primary buckets. The first is our research, evaluation, and plan development, and the study that we're going to be talking about today, I think, fits into that bucket. We also do a lot to provide support to regional stakeholders. So for instance, with grant or funding programs, if you are a public entity or a nonprofit entity, and your program or project is in line with SCAG's Connect SoCal plan, um, which most likely it would be because that's what the grants are also in line with. If you are a nonprofit or public entity and you contact us, we generally are able to write you a letter of support for your project. We also do trainings and tools. So today is a great example of that. And we'll be talking about some of the tools that we provide as we get a little further into the hour and a half that we're here today. In some cases, we can do partnerships where we can partner with entities on funding programs, or through the Sustainable Communities program, we can sometimes provide support for cities to do their own projects. We also do a lot of advocacy and policy work around around areas of clean mobility. So not surprisingly, that's a lot of it's targeted towards getting more funding to our region to further these goals. But we are also coordinating with state and federal agencies on program guidelines as they're developing. And I mentioned I'm the Clean Cities Coalition Director as well, which is a partnership with DOE, and we offer a lot of resources through that as well. Next slide, please. So this slide just gives an overview of some of the research and studies and planning efforts that we have underway. We have a medium and heavy duty site zero emissions roadmap where we'll be looking at site development for heavy duty trucks. And we do work across all modes: transit, passenger, heavy duty, rail, and not in the clean technology program, but SCAG also looks at other emerging technologies such as micromobility and active transportation solutions. Next slide, please. So this is just an important principle of the clean technology program, which is that we want to take a life cycle approach to clean technology. In February 2022, the Regional Council approved a legislative platform which includes a principle that supports taking a life cycle approach. And the idea is that it's not just tailpipe emissions that are an environmental concern, it's the full product design, use of raw materials, its on-road use, as well as its final disposal that we want to be conscious of. And as we're deploying new technologies, we want to make sure that solving one problem doesn't just create another problem. So right now we're in a moment where we have a great opportunity to deploy these things with a life cycle perspective in mind. Next slide, please. And then just in terms of what's next for the Clean Technology Program, as you're probably aware, the next Connect SoCal, or RTP, Regional Transportation Plan, Sustainable Community Strategy, we call it RTP-SCS, but planning has a lot of abbreviations. The development of that is underway right now, and with the intent that it would be finalized by your board in 2024. The plan as a whole sets a vision for transportation and growth across the region. And for clean technology, we are going to be furthering the vision of a zero emission transportation system with a little bit more detail on publicly accessible stations and tools to develop that further. There's going to be a lot of outreach related to the plan. We definitely want to hear from you. What are the challenges your cities are facing? And what kind of best practices do you feel should be showcased in the plan? Next slide, please. And for my final slide, I just wanted to briefly transition from the broader clean technology program to the specific study that we're going to be talking about today. Today, we're going to be talking about the passenger electric vehicle site suitability study, which was a large study over, I want to say, roughly 2 years, where we had 18 different cities participating. And these cities applied to SCAG through the Sustainable communities program. And as the objectives and intent of their applications were similar, we decided to look at all 18 cities in one study. We may have further opportunities for something like this in the future and a future call for projects if your city is interested. And we really wanted to look at, how SCAG and cities within the SCAG region could help advance zero emission vehicles and their supporting infrastructure. And like what information was needed, what are the barriers, what are some key tools, and how can those be addressed? And, as the technology is already being widely deployed, one of our focus areas was infrastructure and hard to serve disadvantaged communities with a focus on multi-unit dwellings. So with that, I'm going to introduce Taylor Briglio. He was the project manager from the consultant team for the PEV study. And I'm going to let him walk through some of our methods and key deliverables and talk about how you can apply them as useful tools. And like I said, we'll have a few pauses for question and answer.
Thank you, Allison. Yes,
Sure.
as Allison mentioned, Will then was hired by SCAG to conduct the study, and I've been the project manager throughout. Yes, it's been 2 years, Allison, when Joe first started this. We are near the end of this tunnel, and so we're happy to kind of share some of the things that we learned over the past couple of years. And so I wanted to start just by briefly kind of setting the stage with where we're at least within the state related to electric vehicles, what the different policies are. And so I'm sure a lot of you are tracking this, but I believe it was in September, Governor Newsom issued an executive order to have 8 million EVs on the road by 2030. And since then, CARB has started to draft the Advanced Clean Cars 2 rule, which will require all new passenger car sales to be zero emission starting in 2035. And they're going to have a bit of a phase in to get to that point. And that's going to align with that 8 million EVs on the road by 2030 target. The CEC has done some analysis regarding what it's going to take to support 8 million EVs. And they're saying it's going to take about 1.2 million chargers across the state to support those chargers, not counting what may be installed at single family residential or kind of private garages. And so as of the beginning of this year, kind of where we're at, well, there's been over 1 million EVs sold in California to date, which is great. Over 12% of all new cars sold, I think at that time in the state were zero emission vehicles. That has continued to accelerate since then. But at that time, there's only about 80,000 charging stations, well short of that 1.2 million number. So there's clearly a lot of work to go, a lot of work to do. And so what are some of these remaining challenges to get to where we need to be by the end of the decade? Some of these challenges include standardization and interoperability across different products and vendors. There's still a variety of plug types out there. So, some standards, the industry is starting to coalesce around certain standards. Hopefully we continue to move in that direction. There's still a lot of education in the general community that's needed to understand kind of the benefits, maybe potential drawbacks of electric vehicle options. There's still a lot of interest. There's still some gaps, but there are some gaps in the market on certain vehicle types. You're not really seeing a lot of low cost sedans out there. Trucks are, not really a lot of trucks on the market yet. So the industry still has got some work to do there. There's still some range anxiety that needs to get worked out. Again, there's been a lot of great work done today, but as we continue to scale, we need to make sure that the vehicles and infrastructure are available to everyone equitably. This also raises the concern of potential available critical materials like lithium, nickel, cobalt if it's still being used, and then grid capacity. We're going to be adding a ton of load to the grid. The utilities need to be prepared to provide that capacity, understand how to better charge those EV charging, how to better charge those vehicles to minimize that strain, and then how can they be a resource, you know, in a V2G scenario, for example. As Allison mentioned, there are 18 cities that participated in this project along the way. It really included a mix of some very large cities that have already done a lot of great work and really have been the leaders of this EV infrastructure movement, including Anaheim, Culver City, Long Beach, and Los Angeles. We've got some smaller cities, you know, Pico Rivera, Artesia, and Redlands, and then we've got a very large representation from the San Gabriel Valley community. So we really got a spectrum of cities at different places along their EV journey, some being still very early on, some having, you know, put in, you know, having some existing infrastructure, but still have a long ways to go, to cities that have already put in hundreds, if not thousands of chargers, or at least those chargers being available to those communities. And so when we started this project 2 years ago, there was a couple of key objectives and project outcomes that we were looking to get, really for three different stakeholder groups. One is for SCAG, one for the participating cities, and then how do we make those relevant for the cities that didn't participate in the project, and then the general public. And so I'm not going to kind of go through all these because we're going to get into, these all get touched on throughout the process, but these were sort of some of our three audiences in developing different tools and materials throughout this project. And what we really wanted to focus today on was some of the tools generated from the study that aren't, you know, they're available to more than just the cities that participated, but are really open to the entire cities in the entire SCAG region. And so one of the big things that we are on the very tail end of finishing up is integrating the results of our suitability analysis with SCAG's existing PEV Atlas. For those of you that are familiar, that is kind of an online GIS portal that has a lot of existing data already related to potential EV infrastructure siting. We've then built on that, integrating some additional variables and characteristics to create a whole host of scenarios, which we'll get into in the next couple of slides. We then took the results of that suitability analysis and started to do site evaluations and really developing a template that other cities can use when they go, you know, if they ever need to go and evaluate other sites. There's a lot of fact sheets and brochures and guides that provide a lot of good EV 101 information that are catered to different audiences, including the general public, property managers of commercial and multifamily dwellings, as well as internal city staff. We did, as part of this project, and one of the earlier steps was really looking at the policies that cities have regarding permitting these EV charging stations and understanding what some of those best practices are, so that permitting does not become a barrier to installing EV infrastructure. We've, you know, throughout the process, we've been outlining different funding sources available and updating that along the way as new sources are being released either at the state or the federal level, including NEVI and the Inflation Reduction Act, you know, passed in the next, you know, in the past couple of years. And we're taking all this information and putting it into a regional EV plan that can, you know, is suitable for not just the cities that participated, but also has a lot of resources and information that is very useful for cities that weren't necessarily in this project, but are at a similar stage along their EV journey. And so now to start to go through some of these actual tools and what they look like. Starting with the suitability analysis, what we did was we, through a stakeholder process, engaging SCAG, the cities, and some other industry stakeholders kind of in the EV world, assembled kind of between 25 and 30 different criteria that should go into how to prioritize a potential location for EV charging stations. And then from that, once we figured out the variables that we wanted to include, started to do some scenario analysis where we started to weight different variables more heavily than others in certain cases to help different cities along different aspects of their EV journey, depending on what they wanted to prioritize. For example, cities that may be earlier in their EV journey may still need to target those prime locations in commercial areas and workplaces just to get that infrastructure going. Cities that have already, where that infrastructure already exists, we've developed scenarios that tend to weight can heavily weight things like multi-unit family dwellings and disadvantaged communities more. And so it helps cities, not just today, but theoretically over several years of infrastructure planning. And then we're integrating, and we did all this work in GIS, and now we're working with the SCAG IT team to integrate this into their PEV Atlas so that anyone can really go in and start to kind of play with the different scenarios, kind of see what sites are weighted more heavily or lower, depending on the scenario that's being used. And this can be used for a variety of different audiences, including cities, developers, city planners, to identify different priority areas. When it comes to, for example, a public sector wanting to use this, a lot of these chargers are going to inevitably be owned and operated by the private sector. And so it provides an opportunity for more targeted outreach in areas where there's a high need or demand for charging that the private sector could potentially meet. And one of the other interesting things is that we found is certain areas where there's maybe a couple blocks of duplexes and triplexes where there's clearly a high need for charging, but there's no kind of large parking, public parking area to install chargers, provide some insight for potential curbside locations that a city may be interested in. And so I'm going to go through a couple of examples of kind of specific cities through different scenarios and what some of the takeaways might be. And so here we have the city of Rosemead under an initiating, progressing, and expanding scenario, which is really layman's terms for not very many chargers, some chargers, and a lot of chargers that may exist in a city. And so if you start to look at all these scenarios across each other, there's a couple of things that you can kind of see right away. One, there are some areas that score very highly across all scenarios. And so that's one example here is circled in blue. And so that can tell, that kind of tells me, okay, if it's highly prioritized across all areas and all different scenarios, let's look at those first to try and deploy EV charging stations. There's also areas that score very lowly across all scenarios. And that's, one example on this is highlighted in red. And so those are areas that you don't want to spend your time investigating. And then there's areas that really start to change depending on the scenario looked at. And so that helps you inform your phasing. And so if we look at the area circled in purple, the one in the middle, in the middle scenario, that's when it scored highest. And so that's something where, okay, it's not necessarily an immediate priority, but more of a midterm priority. And just to kind of go through one more example with another city, here we have the city of Redlands. And again, you kind of see the same cases where you've got areas where in the blue circle, areas that are scoring highly across all scenarios. Those circled in red is an example of where it scored pretty low across all scenarios. And then you've got the one in purple, where in this case, it actually kind of went from red to green across initiating to progressing to expanding. And so the idea behind this is to really help inform developers and planners on where they can start to focus some efforts on where there's, again, either a need or demand for charging. The next tool that we want to discuss is the site evaluation process that we went through, where we looked at the top 100 sites among the participating cities and started to put together some conceptual layouts and rough order of magnitude construction cost estimates. Basically, every city got between 5 and 10 of these. That's how we divvied it up. And the conceptual plans provided insight regarding the recommended power level, quantity, location of chargers within the site itself. Through this, we developed some standard design principles to help guide future projects, not just these, but for other projects that, again, a developer or a city may want to look at in the future. And this blank template on here is available on, or will be available on the SCAG website for other cities to use as a way to help present this information to council or other stakeholders. And so I first want to talk about the design guide that we used to help determine how many charging stations to install at a given site. And for this, we referenced the 2019 new construction building code as a starting point to size the number of level 2 chargers at a site. Now, there's a couple of reasons that we looked at the 2019 code specifically, when the 2022 codes are going to be rolled out in a couple of weeks. The first is that we developed this before the codes were public. So for consistency, we stuck with the old ones. But looking beyond that, in the 2019 building code, you're basically looking at anywhere between 6 to 10% of stalls having an EV charging station. We also recognize that it is typically much more expensive to retrofit a site with EV charging stations than to do it as part of new construction. And so kind of having a slightly lower threshold also keeps in mind overall kind of cost capital intensiveness of these projects. The last point that I wanted to bring up was, if you look in the 2022 building codes, there's actually there's some trigger requirements for existing multifamily dwellings where when you start to alter their parking stall, or the parking spaces, you need to outfit 10% of them or 10% of the altered with EV charging stations. We also see that in certain REACH codes that have been adopted throughout the state or proposed in the state, looking at that 10% threshold for existing buildings. And so that lines up very nicely with what the 2019 building codes were. And so that's kind of a few different reasons why we use this as our starting point. We then adjust this up or down as needed depending on specific sites. And so one example where we go above this code guideline is on these smaller multifamily dwellings that maybe have 10 or so units. It makes more sense to install a charging station in every one of those parking stalls. One, from an equity and fairness perspective, so that you have charging infrastructure available to all tenants. You also tend to gain some cost effectiveness at larger build outs. And so there are cases where you want to look at installing a few more. And the last adjustment that we made is when certain sites are more amenable to DC fast chargers, when they've got very low vehicle dwell times, typically less than an hour, we reduce the level 2 charging stations by a factor of 5 and then round up to determine an equivalent number of DC fast charging. And we actually pull that recommendation from the 2022 building codes, which allow for that. And in sites where there's ADA requirements, we do account for the minimum number of ADA requirement, van accessible, standard, and for very large build outs, potentially an ambulatory stall. As part of our cost estimates, we do break down the total cost into 3 main components. The first are trenching and civil improvements. And so this factors in things like trenching and conduit runs, which typically are anywhere between $100 to $150 per linear foot through hardscape. We see this also includes things like ADA improvements for curb ramps, for restriping, potential grading. We then have a section for electrical upgrades. This accounts for things like new electrical services, panels, breakers, the actual wire and the conduit that goes within those trench runs in the civil section. And then the last is the EV charging station hardware itself. So we've got fairly standardized costs for level 2 chargers, budgeting roughly $5,000 per port. And then for level 3 chargers, looking at a little over $62,000 for an 180 kW port. These costs are basically material costs. They don't include any ongoing networking or maintenance fees for the kind of operation throughout the life of that charger. And so now I want to walk through a few different site evaluations and what these looked like for the cities that participated, and a few different examples that we kind of looked at. So one is what I would say is an easy install. And actually, sorry, before I get into that, I wanted just to highlight the suitability analysis. This is all using a lot of GIS-friendly data, and it doesn't always capture all the relevant characteristics that really make a site viable. So we actually had to filter some of the top scoring sites out for various reasons to actually find sites that could realistically host some EV charging stations. And so things like parking lot size, proximity to power, existing ADA configurations all really impact the viability, or at least the final cost to install an EV charging station. And so now looking at one example, which I would call a quote unquote easy install, would be this example at Artesia Park, where you've got a very large parking lot, which again, using kind of that 10% rule of thumb, allows you to get enough charging stations to be very cost effective on a per port basis. It's got close proximity to utility power, and there's it's got a lot of ADA. The ADA improvements are fairly minimal. It's got access aisles that we can kind of join into very easily with very limited improvements. And so this results in a cost effectiveness or an average cost per port of around $18,000 a port. Typically for level 2 chargers, you'll see anywhere between $10,000 and $50,000, depending on how easy or hard that is. So this is clearly on the lower end of that spectrum. As I mentioned earlier, when we looked at multifamily dwellings, we went above and beyond the minimum code requirements. And so here's an example of like a smaller multi-unit family dwelling in South El Monte, where there were 4 stalls that at least we could see that would be available to either tenants, potentially visitors, but it looked like these were tenant stalls. And one of the potential advantages with MUDs is you can potentially avoid ADA requirements if the kind of project, kind of the owner of the property or the project developer can claim that these stalls are dedicated for specific individuals. So, if this project were, kind of going from, you can kind of see we have stations numbered here. If that was for unit 1, unit 2, unit 3, unit 4, and could reasonably assign those stalls to different tenants, it's no longer kind of publicly accessible, and you don't necessarily need ADA. And again, increasing the number of charging stations we could to what the site can hold. We've got an average cost per port that's still fairly cost effective at around $19,000. And then one more example I wanted to go through briefly is when sites are very difficult or very expensive to install. And so here we actually had a housing community in San Dimas. It looked like it was probably a bunch of townhomes or condos, likely operated by an HOA. And so a lot of the units actually had individual garages or off-street parking. But we also saw that there were a lot of small visitor parking areas kind of scattered throughout the community that could be potential, that might make good for a potential charging station. Now, the problem is that when you have these small kind of build out, or kind of a bunch of these small parking areas kind of scattered throughout the community, you're really limited. There's not a lot of existing ADA, so there's a lot more work related to striping and curb ramps and grading that we have to work through. Powers may not be as readily accessible. And because these were all very small, you don't have an opportunity to really add more charging stations to help spread out some of those fixed costs for new panels and the ADA improvements. And so this results in a relatively expensive install. In this case, we're looking at $41,000 a port, so much higher on that typical $10,000 to $50,000 range that we see. I realize I threw a lot at you guys, so we wanted to take a minute just to have a break, have some preliminary questions and comments. I see the chat blowing up. Off screen if I can. So slides will be available. This will be recorded. The PV Alice, we are still working on that. We should have it uploaded by the time our project concludes at the end of February. I guess we'll take a minute to see if anyone's wanted to raise a hand or add a question in the chat.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in. This is a good time also to share where you might be in your city with your own procedures for determining ideal sites. It'd be great to get some feedback on how you think the site suitability analysis might be helpful. You know, Taylor showed that we have 3 different scenarios to kind of help make it applicable depending on where your city is in their EV journey. And would love to get some feedback on that. And similarly, if you've had key obstacles while doing your conceptual plans, we might be able to talk through some of that with some of the findings of our work. So just again, inviting you to chime in or ask questions if you like.
I see one question in the chat regarding entitlement review. And George, I assume you are referring to entitlement for new development. Okay. So we didn't look at any projects that are, housing developments, commercial developments that are currently, kind of being developed and under kind of review with, the city or AHJ. However, what I can say is that depending on when that project got entitled will determine what code cycle it falls under. Any new construction or major modification, which then falls under new construction, is going to be required to install at least, not necessarily the chargers, but the infrastructure to support this number of chargers in that facility. It is possible that the city has adopted, these were the minimum mandatory measures. If a city has adopted voluntary measures or reach codes, then these numbers would be higher. The site evaluations that we did were all on existing properties. Nothing that was kind of in the pipeline already. Any other questions? All right, we have a question from Aaron. You shared that ADA requirements increases costs. Are there funding sources to help cities cover these added costs? There's a whole host of funding sources, and I'll have a bit of an overview later. There's not a lot specific to just the ADA portion. It's more of a, it's just kind of factored into the overall cost of the build out. And most public sites are going to have to meet ADA requirements. The only 2 times you really don't have to are for fleet charging, because then it's behind a fence, or multifamily, where a property owner is assigning a specific stall to a person, then it's no longer publicly available, or considered publicly accessible. Probably the better terminology there. Any others? Do any fleet charging developments need to meet ADA requirements? Typically not, unless you are going to open up that infrastructure to be publicly accessible too. Can it be done? Yes. Does it make things complicated? Also yes. Generally, fleet charging is exempt. And I would recommend that you keep it that way when you can. Going to move on. We've got one more mid Q&A break after this next section. So next, we wanted to start to talk about the stakeholder and community outreach that we did throughout this process. MBI is also on this call, and they can speak firsthand that they did a lot of it. And there was 2 main areas of stakeholder and community engagement that we did. The first was listening sessions. And so a large portion of that was really meeting with all these individual cities to understand what their current permit processes were and how to understand how it can be streamlined and to be able to share best practices among different cities. We also then had a few more sessions after that where we met with different project developers and property managers to understand their barriers to expanding EV infrastructure. And you all are participating in our last listening session where we're reviewing the results of this study. And the other piece of this was the general community engagement. And so we attended 15 different community events throughout the SCAG region over the course of probably about a year and a half to really engage the public on EV adoption, understanding what their, where do they see the technology? What are their kind of concerns with it? What's holding them back from potentially adopting an EV in the future? And so we developed a lot of outreach collateral to really educate the public. And again, this is another example of a resource that would be available to other cities to use in their own outreach efforts. We also developed surveys to really help quantify some of these barriers to adoption of EVs, not just the vehicles, but the charging infrastructure as well. And so I'm going to start with our policy analysis here. And so when we started the project, AB 1236 was really a focus for SCAG and kind of GOBAs at the state level to really get cities up to compliance with this, which requires cities to do two things. One, pass an ordinance that formally streamlines their EV charging station permitting, and to develop a checklist and post it to the website, to the city's website, that outlines everything that must be included in a permit application. And then about halfway through this process, AB 970 was then adopted, which then kind of builds on and supersedes AB 1236 and establishes timelines for cities to review and approve EV permits. And there's two timeline breakdown, or kind of two thresholds, depending on how big that build out is. And so if it's between 1 and 25 stations, it's a shorter approval timeline for cities. And then if it's more than 25 stations, then there's a longer approval timeline that cities have. The other thing that cities should be aware of with AB 970 is that a permit is considered complete and approved after these applicable timelines if the city hasn't issued any deficiency notices or issued otherwise approvals to build those charging stations. And so we've got a bit of a flow chart here on the right that really describes, AB 1236. It's that the ordinance and the checklist are really the two big pieces to comply with that. We heavily encourage cities, and I think the ordinance requires cities to be able to accept at least signatures electronically. And so there's, some cities are still doing kind of paper permit applications. So if there's an ability to move not just your EV permits, but all your other permitting online, really provides, can really help streamline a lot of applications. Once the permit is submitted, it's for the city, it's up for the city to complete a plan review for health. One of the factors, things where cities are allowed to kind of push back on is if there's health and safety issues with the potential build out. Issue a deficiency notice within 5 to 10 days. The developer or the permit applicant can then resubmit, kind of go through that cycle. Hopefully it's just once. And then after kind of that timeline, there's an approval to build. If it's after that resubmittal, they've got another 20 days to approve that project, 40 if it's a longer timeline, or if it's a larger build out. And so what did we learn from cities, when we talked to them about how they're handling their permitting? And while a lot of cities didn't necessarily adopt ordinances and have checklists, a lot of cities were issuing these permits fairly quickly. Typically this is handled as a plan check, usually under an electrical permit, especially in these residential applications. And so at the residential level, when it's just one charger in a garage or in a driveway, these permits are being issued over the counter, maybe a few days max. And so there's no issue with meeting, these permitting requirements at the state level or timelines at the state level for residential applications. Commercial applications, this is when things can get a little bit more complicated. Depending on the complexity of the project, we're seeing cities turn these around anywhere between a few days to a few weeks. Anywhere from a few days to a few weeks, depending on how complex it is. You might need to start getting civil, electrical, kind of involved in that plan review. But generally, most cities, we think, will be able to meet those AB 970 deadlines. there may be some unique cases where if cities are starting to some of these smaller cities we found were outsourcing some of the permitting to LA County, for example, and then you're sort of no longer in control of your own destiny there, which can extend the timeline. And so continuing to be proactive, or some of these other ways, taking things online, having these checklists to really minimize those review times, can prove to be very helpful in meeting these requirements. The other thing that we learned in talking with the cities, that goes beyond just the permitting aspect of it, with a lot of cities are very interested in installing EV charging stations on publicly owned property. But there's a lot of things that they still either need or didn't fully understand, or that were barriers to kind of moving forward with that. How to develop projects, there's a lot of different chargers out there, how to select equipment and being able to navigate different vendors. Funding is obviously, will always be a constraint for cities to implement capital projects. And then how to then manage the ongoing operation and maintenance of these chargers. Unfortunately, these things are not a set it and forget it. They require some form of, ongoing management, whether that's, setting rate, charging rates, or managing the utilization, maintaining them when, plugs break, or, worse, they get vandalized. So those are all barriers that these cities are still facing to owning and operating chargers on their property where they can directly control that. I will say that our listening sessions, I believe, did have an actual impact on the cities becoming more being into compliance with AB 1236. And so as part of the policy memos that we issued, we included some resources, including streamlined ordinances, or ordinances that would meet the requirements that cities could very easily adopt. There were staff reports that they could use, and there were template checklists that we provided that cities could then either slap their name on it or customize it if they felt like they needed to for their specific cities. And so at the start of the project, we really only saw 2 cities kind of in full compliance. And now we're looking at about 6. And now this is tracked. These are maps that are pulled from GoBiz. And so I think Los Angeles, it was in the news that they actually were moving forward on passing an ordinance to actually come into full compliance. Again, LA was, they've probably got one of the more streamlined permitting processes out there. So clearly having an ordinance in place didn't necessarily negatively impact the speed at which permits were being issued. What we also found very interesting about halfway through the process is that a lot of cities actually adopt LA County Electrical Code. And within the LA County Electrical Code, there is a streamlined ordinance that GoBiz isn't necessarily catching, because they're looking at what cities pass separately. And so a lot of cities have actually adopted that ordinance, whether they realize it or not, which was we found very interesting kind of throughout this. And so, and again, it's having an ordinance in place wasn't necessarily delaying getting these permits issued. And so something that we again, that's kind of one of the insights that we got throughout this process. Moving on to the other piece of this, which is the community engagement and kind of public education piece of this. Again, we attended 15 events throughout the course of the project. We kind of, between community events and then some virtual outreach, we've collected nearly 500 survey results. And so we'll go and get into some of those in the next few slides. But some of, while we were also at these events, we got a chance to kind of speak with the community and just really have more casual conversation on what their thoughts were on EVs. And so probably not too many surprises here. Some of the common barriers for this more general EV adoption is either a lack of or not aware of the public charging network, which hopefully continues to grow over time in terms of the available infrastructure. Range anxiety, and then coupled with that lack of a inadequate charging network are still barriers for those that may have maybe longer commutes or do more long distance driving. Still not being fully aware of the benefits, both the financial and environmental. converting to an EV. And so you've kind of got that, higher upfront cost, but lower ongoing costs related to fuel and maintenance savings. And so, people not necessarily understanding that over the lifetime of the vehicle, they're going to come out ahead or expected to come out ahead financially. And just in my own personal life, when my friends ask me about this, well, what about the emissions of the electricity produced? Understanding, where that electricity comes from and the greenhouse gas intensity of that compared to the greenhouse gas intensity of burning gasoline, in California especially, you're coming out ahead on the greenhouse gas side as well. But again, people not really understanding that is another opportunity to increase education. Some of these encouraging signs is that, a lot of cities or a lot of the public understand that this is coming. And so they want to continue to learn more. They know that this EV ownership will increase and that, we do need to continue to plan for this, on the infrastructure side, on the grid capacity side. So there's some encouraging signs that we are also seeing. Getting into kind of who took the survey. And so as I mentioned, we got about 500 results total. And so we got a pretty good mix of either homeowners or those that live in single family homes, renters, and then business, either commercial or multifamily property owners. And so, we kind of got a good mix on what their kind of needs and challenges are to adopting or installing EV charging infrastructure. And again, given we also kind of try to track where these respondents typically either lived, worked, or where they regularly visit or spend their time. And again, understanding, it's not a super precise way of understanding kind of where these people are, where they might be, but it kind of tells you where you might need some of that infrastructure. While the focus within the participating cities, we did get some other respondents either within the Southern California region or even a little bit beyond SoCal. And so kind of a high level of some of our survey results. So looking at the barriers for people to buying an EV, purchase costs, still by far one of the biggest challenges or barriers. But when you look at the issues related to charging infrastructure, not being able to charge at home or lack of charging infrastructure combined, those are almost as big of a range kind of being another limiting factor. And so when we look at where respondents say that they want to see charging infrastructure, we see a lot of it in the public. So public parking lots, their primary residence, other commercial areas or public areas where respondents wanted to see this charging infrastructure be deployed. And so if you are able to start to increase that charging infrastructure in these areas, we would expect those barriers in that first graph to start to come down, at least related to the charging infrastructure. So now when it comes to getting that charging infrastructure on the ground, within the survey, we had said, if you're a property, commercial or multifamily property owner, what are your barriers to installing charging infrastructure? And cost was by far the largest one. Everything else was kind of significantly less of a barrier, or at least perceived barrier. Permitting, while not the largest barrier, always room for improvement there, but kind of reflects what we were seeing when we were talking with the cities. We also found that if you can cover between a quarter and half of the total cost of that charging station, that's enough to get a significant portion of those property owners to convert to EVs. And so you don't need to cover all of it, but you need to cover a significant portion of it. And we're going to take a moment here to have another question and comment break. I saw a few things going on in the chat.
Taylor, I just wanted to speak to the second question in the chat, which is a a little bit broader about the public education content that's available. And I just wanted to make a broader statement. I put the website for our study in the chat. And currently we have the electric vehicles brochure that Taylor mentioned in both English and Spanish. It's available as a PDF. So it's not editable, but feel free to use the content. And then more resources such as the site plan template that Taylor showed earlier, and some of our policy memos and our final materials will be accessible at that website. So it's not complete, as the study will be finalized in February 2023, but if you wanted to check out what we do have to date, or just bookmark the page for the future, I put it in the chat. And so I just wanted to address that question. And Taylor, I think there were 2 or 3 other questions that came up. The first one is, can permits be issued without an ordinance?
Absolutely. That's what we've been seeing in all these other cities that haven't formally passed an ordinance. The ordinance was really a way to formalize the streamlining process. And again, what we found was that even whether it was formalized or not, it wasn't impacting, or we didn't see a significant impact on how quickly those permits were issued. A lot of cities are, for, private residential, single family residential, or even some small multifamily, it gets processed as an electrical permit, just like you would any other major electric appliance. It's just sort of another, another box to check. And again, a lot of the cities here are still, even for the larger public ones, again, they're still issuing permits. It goes through the same permitting process like any other project would. There's a question on the embodied carbon on the batteries. And so I assume this refers to the environmental benefits I was alluding to. And so if you look at most published life cycle assessments of EVs compared to gasoline, typically the embodied carbon is higher in the production of the vehicle. So it's more upfront greenhouse gas emissions. But when you factor in the life cycle and operation of that vehicle, you come out ahead because the greenhouse gas intensity of electricity is significantly lower than the greenhouse gas intensity of burning gasoline. And so over the entire life cycle, you come out ahead. Now, if you bought a Honda Accord and a Chevy Bolt and left them both in a warehouse and never used them, yeah, you're coming out behind on the EV. But we hope that people are buying vehicles to drive them and not just sit in a garage. Are there accountability measures for ESG standards? So we didn't really look at ESG here. I'm not sure. I mean, there's a few different ways you can be going with this. If you're looking at, ESG standards of different, manufacturers and vehicles, we didn't look into that. That's a whole nother ball game on ESG standards and ratings of companies. Typically, those are a factor of risk, not necessarily a measure of, or it's a measure of risk management, not necessarily a measure of how environmentally friendly you are or not. I think a lot of that's kind of come up in the past few months, kind of more understanding there.
For those not familiar with that term, can you state out what ESG is referring to?
So, I mean, ESG typically is environmental, social governance. Okay. Yeah, that's something that's kind of come up in the last probably 5 to 10 years with companies trying to better manage their impact, their environmental impact, their social impact, and their how they govern internally. So I will say, and I think this kind of came up with Tesla not being very high on the ESG ratings because of the way that this is measured. Again, it's not a measure of a company's, greenness. It's a measure of how they manage each of those. And so you actually see a lot of oil and gas companies have very high ESG ratings because they're really good at managing risk.
Great.
So time frame to have a net carbon negative effect for the life cycle. So when you come out ahead on the life cycle, depends on again how intense how greenhouse gas intense that electricity is. If it's so it's not really a straight number. If you're powering on solar, you're going to reach that much quicker, and it depends on how much you're driving. But if you're like on a primarily natural gas, then you're still going to come out ahead, but it's going to take a little bit longer. I thought I saw something in the last week or so that was like you could probably come out ahead within the first couple of years. But again, it depends. Again, cost of consulting answers, it depends. But you figure most LCAs are, you're looking at either the entire vehicle life of 10 to 15 years, or even on a 5-year, you typically, we'll see some of those benefits.
I might recommend California Air Resources Board to look into some of those resources. I'm not aware of a specific one, but I know that they've done total cost of ownership, which is a little bit different, but whereas total cost of ownership is looking into, all the cost of not just purchasing, but maintaining and operating the vehicle. And so I would suggest maybe looking there for more deeper level analysis on life cycle impact of manufacturing and production. It's something that we're definitely interested. I think I mentioned in the beginning, we want to make sure that, what we're promoting is holistically beneficial and not just, replacing one problem with a different problem. But at this point, we're not, I would say we're not, at least not as part of this study. We haven't analyzed the technology from a full life cycle perspective. But I think the brochure that I had the link for in the chat has some information about the total cost of ownership, which is something that CARB also has done a lot of work on.
Okay, couple other questions. Are there any preparations for Scope 3 ESG standards? So that is not something that we specifically looked at in this study. I can say that there's a whole industry around that is continuing to try and develop standards and best practices for measuring and reporting Scope 3 emissions for different companies. In terms of, is something like that relevant for these projects? Maybe. Kind of depends on what the use case is here. You're a company, let's say Willdan, right? If Willdan's going to install, we're looking at our own greenhouse gas impact. Looking at our Scope 3 emissions can include things like employee commuting. And so Willdan's providing a way to reduce their employee commuting emissions by providing, EV charging. That's one way to bring it down. If, let's say, Willdan has a fleet of vehicles and they're converting them from gas to electric, that's Scope 1 emissions, but, that's a way for them to bring it down. So, they're relevant to the extent that they matter to the project. But I think it kind of depends on really the use case, and really wasn't a focus of this particular project.
I think we're doing pretty well on time. Why don't we go through the rest of the presentation, and then we can come back to the remaining questions in the chat. I think they're more, I think they're similar to what we've already covered about different scopes of emissions and life cycle emissions, but let's get through our content and we can continue that discussion at the end if there's time.
All right, last segment here. So again, just a quick overview of some of the other tools that are going to be available for cities at the end of this project. As I've alluded to earlier, there's a lot of educational material here. We've provided, I'm calling them EV 101 guides that cities can use to help educate city staff on, the basics of electric vehicles, different charging stations, their use cases, their costs, different ownership structures, an overview of funding sources, which is constantly getting updated in the real world. But there's a lot of good educational material there that will be available for cities. The general brochures geared towards educating the public is something that cities can use during their own outreach and engagement efforts. Similarly, for guides for property managers, that's something that they can provide to different property managers that may be interested in installing EV charging infrastructure. Policy memos with best practices. And so again, as we kind of interviewed all these cities through our listening sessions, we got a good sense on what are some of the different best practices that cities can do to help streamline these permit applications. And then we also provided with those a lot of resources that I mentioned earlier, including staff reports, sample ordinances, and checklists that would comply with the legislation, but also help be potentially helpful to really increase. I think the checklist has been some cities have really appreciated that because it helps increase the quality of the permit applications that are coming in. When a developer knows exactly what they need to submit the first time, really helps reduce kind of the need for revisions. And I think one of the cities we were talking with, I think it was Long Beach, kind of hit on the idea that, well, maybe even making multiple checklists depending on different types of projects. Maybe having one that's more of a single family residential and one that's more for like larger commercials when those projects get more complex. And then lastly, we are working on our infrastructure plan right now. Again, the project is scheduled to conclude at the end of February, so should be available by that time. Kind of coming back to something I mentioned in the beginning, as we are putting this plan together, one of the things that we're sort of continuing to flesh out here is what are the charging needs within the region and within each of the participating cities. And so we go back to what the CEC kind of put together on their estimates of about 1.2 million chargers by the end of the decade, and their analysis. And that report was from July of 21, which was before a lot of this funding for DC fast chargers that were put out. But really was a high level 2 scenario where 97% of these chargers would be at places like workplaces, multifamily dwellings, public commercial areas, and then only about 3% DC fast charging. In any case, we kind of took that statewide level and really started to scale it down using factors like car ownership and population to figure out what SCAG would need and what each of the individual cities would need. And so SCAG's going to need about 500,000 chargers by the end of the decade. So there's a lot of work that still has to be done there. Kind of using this metric for the city of Los Angeles, which was the largest city in the project and in SCAG in general, they're going to need upwards of over 100,000 chargers by the end of the decade. I think their last public goals was, in the order of like 10 to 20,000. And so, some of these cities that have already done a lot of good work, maybe this helps them really think, okay, do we need to reevaluate what some of our medium and long-term goals need to be and how do we get there? We also know that some cities are very interested in the DC fast charger model. Joe, I'm calling you, Joel from Culver City, I'm calling you out here. But we want to make sure that, this pathway is a high level 2 pathway. And so when cities are interested in doing more of DC fast chargers and replicating the gas station model, again, kind of going back to that recommendation earlier of kind of a 5-to-1 swap for every 5 level 2 chargers, you can replace that with 1 DC fast charger. And so there's going to be some scenario analysis in the final reports that really show what these charger breakdowns look like under different kind of, call them build out pathways, if you will. Funding. So how does all this get paid for? And the good news is there's a lot of funding out there. The bad news is that everyone is going after it all at the same time. And so we are going to provide a review of a lot of the largest funding sources out there, including things like the infrastructure bill that was passed in 2021 that has multiple provisions for EV projects, the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed a few months ago that has additional tax credits for EVs and charging infrastructures, that very interestingly cities may be able to take advantage of these tax credits in 2024 because they may get issued as a direct payment, which is very new because traditionally cities have been tax exempt, don't get to take advantage of those types of funding sources, and now they can. The DOE, as part of that infrastructure bill, has block grants that they are issuing that it can include EV infrastructure. A lot of stuff at the state level. California is putting literally billions of dollars towards EV infrastructure for light, medium, heavy duty vehicles, chargers, everything. You've got the low carbon fuel standard credit that can provide some ongoing charging revenue. At the utility level, down at the local level and utility level, a lot of utilities are putting money on covering the cost of this infrastructure, time of use rates to reduce the cost of charging. There is a lot of money being thrown out here. And like most large, for larger capital projects, or efforts like this, typically you're going to have to cobble all these different funding sources together to really make the biggest dent. But there is money out there. Identify it early, early in the process. Having projects, under development or near developed, really help increase the competitiveness of a lot of these funding applications. In some cases, it's a requirement. And so just know that there's a lot out there, and this will be outlined in our final reports. I did want to take 1 minute to really talk about NEVI. And so NEVI is the National EV Infrastructure kind of pot of money that is apportioned from the Infrastructure Jobs Act from 2021, because we now have a little bit of information on how this money is actually going to get doled out in California. And so California is going to receive $384 million of that infrastructure bill money, specifically over 5 years, specifically for DC fast chargers along alternative fuel corridors. That is formula money issued to the state. The CEC is going to be issuing this funding as competitive grants, kind of in tranches throughout the next 5 years, kind of targeting different segments of corridors every 6 months or so. These projects have, from the federal guidelines, the projects have to have a minimum of 4 150 kW ports within 1 mile of an alternative fuel corridor, no more than 50 miles apart. That is the federal requirement. In California, they are saying you must then future-proof this even beyond this to include an extra port, and all these ports must be capable of 350, or at least the infrastructure and the conduit must be sized for that. You can install 150, but if you had to upsize to 350, that infrastructure can support it. So California, again, going above and beyond, something that a lot of the cities likely be very interested in. Only private sector applicants can go after these funds. A public agency cannot be the lead applicant on these NEVI projects. It's got to be the private sector. You can partner with the private sector on this, but no, cities, you cannot you cannot directly go after this money. The CEC is also going to up the match share requirement. So typically federal funding is 20% local match, 80% federal cost share. CEC in some areas, that's going to have to be a 50% match. It's going to depend on the area. They will allow for 20% match along certain segments that I think are lower income disadvantaged. And they've got some guidance published that sort of outlines what those different segments are. And then half of the funding needs to be used for disadvantaged communities. 40% must be used for Justice 40 communities. And so just for those that are a little bit unfamiliar, disadvantaged communities is something that California kind of did kind of on their own a while ago. It's usually through you kind of see it through EnviroScreen, and it looks at things like pollution burden and income and a whole host of other factors to determine what's disadvantaged or not, and that typically looks at the top 25% of census tracts related in those factors. And then the Justice 40 is something that the Biden administration has done that looks at similar, it's a similar metric, and they look at kind of the top, kind of the top 40%. So there's a lot of overlap between the two, but they're not completely the same. But that is how California is going to be doling out some of this funding. And then sort of our last slide, again, what are some of these city best practices? What are some next steps and recommendations for cities? Not for those that just participated, but for other cities that are looking at, how to increase EV infrastructure. The first thing we would recommend is, review what's available in your city, establish or revise targets for, how much infrastructure you want to be available by 2030 that aligns with these statewide goals. What is going to be your share of that 1.2 million in the next 7 or 8 years? Understand that a lot of that charging infrastructure will not be owned or controlled by the public sector, but where you do have city-owned properties, continue to evaluate those, because a lot of publicly owned properties or publicly owned sites are heavily trafficked or or kind of notable in the community. Things like city halls, things like parks, things like libraries, city-owned parking lots are all great places to help kickstart infrastructure if your city doesn't already have it. There are a lot of requirements also related to fleet electrification. And so if you haven't started looking at that, we encourage you to look at that soon, because you're going to have to start buying them whether you like it or not, according to the state. And again, outside of the stations that you can directly control on your properties, maybe even curbside, again, a lot of this is going to be outside of your direct control. So what role does the city really have here in encouraging EV infrastructure development? And so you've got options with your policies, you've got options with funding and general coordination. And so a couple of policy examples, we've talked about permitting already and kind of setting up any internal processes to help streamline them, but also look at your code cycles. So we just, I'm sure a lot of the cities have already adopted their 2022 building codes. There are voluntary measures that go above and beyond for new construction to really increase that EV infrastructure for anything that's in the pipeline for housing, commercial or otherwise. So adopting, say, tier 2 is a great first step that you guys can take. For cities that already have a lot of EV infrastructure where tier 2 is not enough, there are reach codes that can go above and beyond even that, that cities can entertain, that can be adopted outside of the typical triannual code cycle. Something that we find is also very helpful is having a dedicated landing page about, with a lot of EV infrastructure on your website, understanding, things like what, not just the permitting requirements, but connections to funding, things like Charge Ready, things, directing them to resources like the CEC with NEVI funding, helps get that information in the hands of more people so that, they can continue to develop projects quicker. And again, knowing that a lot of this is in the private sector, a lot of the sites that we evaluated are privately owned sites. And so we've provided some site evaluations that you can use to help kickstart that outreach and potentially spark project development where, you can come to a site and say, hey, SCAG did this study, your site came, kind of scored very highly, there's a need or demand for charging infrastructure, your site, may be able to support that. Use that as an intro to kind of get them thinking about EV infrastructure, and then directing them to some of these resources that we've provided for them to then install it. That was the last slide that we had. We've got a few minutes left for any final questions. Okay, hearing none, there is a quick survey that SCAG wants you to take. I think the AV team also mentioned that this may be available. It might pop up after the Zoom. I'll defer to them on the specifics, but feel free to take a quick 2-minute survey on this.
Yeah, and just plug again, a lot of the resources that Taylor mentioned will be forthcoming on our website, probably end of February as the project wraps up. So like a template policy overview, the EV guide for cities, the brochure is already up there, the site plan, the site conceptual plan template, and how to do your own calculations related to site planning will all be available. So please stay tuned for the next steps of this study as we wrap up. Okay, well, I think a wonderful thing has happened and we've ended early. We are available for additional questions if needed, but we really appreciate you attending this Toolbox Tuesday. And I want to thank Taylor and the rest of the project team. Pamela was on the phone. I saw Kima on the phone earlier. And, you know, and as well as the cities who've participated. So I saw Culver City, Anaheim, and some of the others in the chat. I might be missing some, but really appreciate everybody's participation in this effort. Pamela, did you have your hand up? I think I just saw you put your hand up. I don't know if that was intentional or not.
No, I had it up because I just wanted to mention, hi, everybody. So I'm with MBI Media, as Taylor mentioned, and I was very privy to speaking to all participants, whether it was the city personnel and the residents actually at events. And one of the things that, you know, it's really going to be a challenge here. It's almost like a chicken and the egg scenario. You know, cities, you know, sometimes feel like, well, we don't need a lot of chargers because people aren't buying the vehicles. But on the same token, people will probably be more opt to purchase an electric vehicle if they know that they can charge at their place of business or at their shopping center. So I really think that this is very important. And residents are excited and they want to be a part of this. But again, I think it's just going to take a great effort to help them get over the hesitancy. And I think that being able to charge is going to be the key to success.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, there's a lot of work underway in this area, whether it be vehicle incentives, infrastructure incentives, guidelines, and like building codes, et cetera, et cetera. So it's definitely an area where we're making progress as a region. And we will be covering a lot of this in our Connect SoCal plan, as I mentioned earlier. So if you have any other feedback, please feel free to reach out, visit our project site, and we'll be in touch. I believe our next Toolbox Tuesday is in about a month on curb space management. And I think with that, we can end our presentation. Thank you everyone for attending.